So where most of you are in your revision process is at the point of paragraph structure. So paragraph structure talks about the things that we've talked about before in class, including topic sentences, evidence, analysis, and implications. So most of you already know how to write a topic sentence. So overall, the most important things about topic sentences is to make it clear about what the paragraph will be talking about, and to use the language of your thesis if you are using a closed thesis. So I'll show an example of that in a minute. And then the third thing is to make a connection between your paragraphs so that you have some transitions and coherence in between them. And I'll talk more about transitions later in the video. But for the most part, a topic sentence looks like this paragraph right here. So this paragraph uses a topic sentence to tell us that we're going to be talking about business scandals. And it does this really simply just by saying multiple scandals have occurred over the past few decades. So I know that we're going to be talking about multiple scandals. This essay goes on to give a little bit of context by giving a definition for what a business scandal is. Not all essays and paragraphs will need this, but that's a good way to transition into a paragraph. So going back to the previous document, that's what a topic sentence will look like. It tells you what the paragraph is about, and then it uses language from the thesis. Evidence is another area where most students feel comfortable because there's pretty simple rules for how to include evidence in your essay. So there's three main ways, which I've given you a document on how to quote, paraphrase, and summarize. But the main thing about quote, paraphrase, and summary is that quoting is often the easiest because it's instantly recognizable as evidence, but you only want to quote the part that you actually are going to analyze later on in your essay paragraph. So if you find that your quote is really long because you think that you need to include some additional context, use paraphrasing and summarizing to give context. And this will make it so that you don't have a huge, like, 6-line quote. So that's pretty easy. In terms of your evidence, make sure that you're using all 4 types. You also have notes from this. Most of you are great about using statistics. Many of you are already using anecdotes. Anecdotes can help make your statistics more personal. And many of you are also using authoritative evidence. So authoritative evidence is when you introduce a person or an organization before your evidence, saying the American Heart Association says that we should get 60 minutes of activity every single day. So by introducing the authority figure, that helps me give authoritative evidence. It also is backed up with statistical evidence when I say something like 60 minutes a day. And then finally, logical evidence. This is one that I don't see as often in student essays yet, because this one requires some creativity. This is where you are basically creating your own evidence to support your point. So it might look like an analogy by saying X is like Y, and so why don't we treat X like Y? One student said that Christopher Columbus and Adolf Hitler both were responsible for the murder of millions of people, yet we still celebrate Columbus every Columbus Day. Why don't we reject him like we have rejected Adolf Hitler? So that's an analogy. You could also use a syllogism. If X is true and Y is true, then Z must also be true. So for an example about the benefits of raising the minimum wage, when people have higher wages, then they can work less. When people are working less, they're able to spend more time making cultural contributions through art and science. Therefore, if we raise the minimum wage, people will spend more time making cultural contributions through art and science. So that's how a syllogism would work. And then finally, you really need to make sure that you're introducing your your evidence. This means that you don't want to have a random quote placed in your paragraph and nobody knows where it came from. So this means that you need to introduce where it's coming from, such as this organization found, or at the very least, introduce why it matters to your argument, such as, for example, if you're giving an example. So we'll go back to this paragraph over here. This student goes and introduces evidence right here by saying, one company that had a business scandal. One company that had a business scandal. This is a transition to introduce the evidence. And this is an example of anecdotal evidence because we're talking about one corporation that had a business scandal. This whole section here is evidence and context. So that's a big section of evidence and context that this student will have to then analyze. And so when the student is analyzing, they'll have to be really specific about what it is that they are analyzing. Which brings us back to the next part of paragraph writing, which is analysis. So the very first thing that you need to know about analysis is that analysis is not the same as summary. So your analysis needs to come after your evidence because your evidence is the thing that you're analyzing. So sometimes people get ahead of themselves. They put their analysis before their evidence. Make sure that your evidence is coming, or your analysis is coming after your evidence so that your reader knows what it is that you're talking about. When you are analyzing your evidence, some of you will have a quote that is maybe like 3 sentences long, and then you say, this evidence demonstrates. But we don't know exactly what you're talking about. So really try to avoid demonstratives, which are words that are like indicators, like this and that. Be really specific. So instead of like this quote shows, say the information the information from this quote shows a certain thing. Another way that you can do this is by using a bunch of these strategies that I am going to list for you. So there's lots of ways that you can add analysis to your paragraph. And so I've listed many different strategies here. At the very least, use one, but if you really want to push yourself, then you can use multiple analysis strategies. Many of you use these instinctually already, and so these are just another way to be mindful about how you're actually composing your writing. So we'll go back to this example in a minute because this student uses a couple of these, including cause and effect, explaining the reasoning, and then I believe she also uses compare and contrast. So when we go back here, we've already pointed out that the student has used a large section of this paragraph to give evidence and context, and now the student will have to be able to give analysis for this. So when we go down here, we're going to start seeing where she goes into her analysis. So she starts by saying all business scandals. So she says this scandal is one of many because she used anecdotal evidence. One thing that all scandals have in common is public ignorance being used to the company's advantage. Then her analysis comes into play. She says, due to the flexibility and deregulation of business markets at certain points, corporations are able to take part in shady business practices. This right here is an example of cause and effect. So this whole section right here is a cause and effect because we have flexibility and deregulation in the business market. Corporations are able to take part in these business practices. So that's how she's analyzing the anecdotal evidence that she just gave. Then she goes on to say, a majority of the time, they are not obliged to inform the public at what they're doing, and if they are required to report their business practices, there are often loopholes that allow businesses to keep their actions away from the public eye. So this is another cause and effect. So they're not obliged to inform, so they keep the public out of they keep their information away from the public, and then if they are required, then there's also loopholes. So they're not obliged, and then there's loopholes. This is another cause and effect that allows the businesses to continue their shady practices. And then the student uses another strategy. She says they choose to do this because it benefits the company in the short term through higher profits, but the companies do not consider the long-term impact on consumers and even themselves. So this right here is explaining the reasoning. Because she's explaining why the businesses choose to do these shady things, even though it often has long-term impacts on consumers and themselves. Referring back to the evidence about how the shady business practices actually brought down the company, this is explaining why they choose to do that, even when it has negative impacts on them. So these are at least two strategies that the student used in their analysis. And then finally, when we go back to this sheet, there is the implications that you can use to connect your reason back to your thesis. And this is really important because even if you have proven that your reason is true, that doesn't necessarily tell me, the reader, that your thesis is true. So in our theses, we made either a claim of value or a claim of policy, or kind of a combination of all three in one sentence. And so you need to connect back to those parts of your thesis in order to show how your reason is supporting those things. So you can do this by using the strategies from analysis, so any of these strategies to connect back to your thesis. Or you can also use some of the other sentence stems that we have gone over in class. And then you can also use this time and this space to synthesize your evidence to show how your evidence works together in order to support your thesis. So we'll go back to this student example. And this student says here that this section is the implications. And so right here it says that, however, there are many actions the public can and government can take. So this connects back to her thesis that we need to take action to support or to prevent corporation and business. So this is right here is implication. So there are many actions. One is stronger regulations, and then encouraging the public to stay informed. And then it says this would be effective, so another sentence stem right here, because when people put their guard down and stop paying attention, corporations will use public ignorance to their advantage. This section can still be improved a little bit by connecting, like it says why public ignorance gets in the way of holding businesses accountable, but then it says you can add to this by saying then the public can hold businesses accountable for their actions. So this is an example of an essay that goes and uses evidence to support the topic sentence, uses analysis to connect the evidence to that topic sentence, and then uses implication to connect the reason itself back to the thesis. And so this is a very aligned paragraph that is an exemplary example of where a draft might be before your revision process. That's not, of course, to say that this paragraph is totally perfect, but this would be a good reference to look back on. So going back to this document of all of the things that you can be focusing on in your paragraph structure when you're revising is making sure that you have a strong topic sentence that uses language from your thesis, use evidence that is very specific to your topic sentence in order to prove your point, then use analysis to connect your evidence back to your reason using a variety of strategies, at least one, and then using the same strategies from analysis to connect your whole reason back to your thesis. So if you have any questions on this area, you can send me an email or talk to me in class. But overall, I hope that this document will be helpful in helping you revise your essay.